Buckle up because coming up next we have Claire Kwong, who makes interactive art to dramatize her personal experience with technology. She uses computation to create interactive experiences and performances. And wait for it, she also makes live visual for electronic music shows. So without further ado, let's show Claire some love in the chat.
Hi, I'm Claire Kwong. Today I'll talk about playing with touch and intimacy. I'm going to talk about my experiences developing and exhibiting games that enable players to move and touch. I make games that make people move. I'm an artist and developer. I work as a software engineer, but a few years ago, I did a master's degree in computational arts at Goldsmiths, University of London. I took a few classes in game development from my instructor, Phoenix Perry, who introduced me to a lot of these concepts. Most importantly, this gave me the time and the space to make art and games. Let's start with why I got interested in games about touch. I'm actually naturally touch phobic, and that's a combination of my personality and my background. I've always been a bit shy and socially anxious. My family is Chinese, and my parents are immigrants from Hong Kong. We weren't really big huggers when I was growing up. I don't remember touching them much at all. Asian culture tends to be much more touch averse than American culture. I also grew up in a suburb. We had a house and a car, and we didn't have to see anybody. I felt isolated. When I moved to a city, I still felt isolated. In New York, we have the concept of a personal bubble. Even though we have to get physically close to each other, on the subways and the streets, we need to maintain our bubbles to respect others. Society establishes boundaries against touching other people. And for good reason, right? People should be respectful. Why would you touch a stranger? COVID brought a new dimension to this. Touch became a risk. Everything became contaminated. Also, as a woman, I feel like I receive mixed messages about touch. On one hand, I'm socialized to be warm. People come in for a hug even after I meet them for the first time. But I need to be sensitive and hyper aware of consent, harassment, uninvited touch. But at the same time, I wanted touch. I was on my phone and my computer all day. I felt disconnected from my body, disconnected from other people. I still do. I wanted to question this and explore the idea of touch. So, when I started making art and games, I felt a desire to go against this, make people move, make people touch, make people uncomfortable. I thought I could use art and games to do this because it's socially acceptable, if it's just a game, right? I could experience things that I couldn't in real life, and I wanted to let other people do that too. So when I was coming up with ideas, I first looked at inspirations. What are some situations where people touch where they normally wouldn't? First, I drew inspiration from performance art, especially from the 60s and 70s. Performance art is staged tense encounters between performer and audience. This is Yoko Ono, and this is a piece called Cut Piece. She asked the audience to come up to her and cut her clothes off her body. She put herself in a vulnerable position, which reverses artist and audience. People also touch in partner dance. Ballet dancers tell a story with just the movement of their bodies and how they interact with each other. At the end of the ballet, there's a dance called the pas de deux, which is French for step of two. Two dancers move really closely with each other to tell the climax of the story. In partner dance, movement and touch are the main methods of communication. Finally, most of us have probably played Twister. It's a kid's game where you spin a spinner and it tells you one color and one body part to put on it, like put your right leg on the red dot. Twister uses simple rules to create complicated positions, but these positions are constrained by people's bodies and what they're willing to do. Drawing from these inspirations, I wrote down what I wanted my games to achieve, These were my design goals. I wanted to make games that encourage movement, encourage communication, and encourage touch. But I had to design my games around some limitations. The limits of technology, phones, projections, web servers, limits of bodies. The human body inherently has physical constraints, right? And I also wanted to design games that most people could access. Finally, the limits of social norms and what people are comfortable with. This can be quite challenging when designing games around touch. Some of these limits are possible to move forward or break, but some of them are not. I'm not going to invent technology that lets people be in somebody else's body, right? But I can encourage people to bend social norms and do something that they might normally not. So let's see what I came up with. I started with Chromapose. This is a game that makes people dance together with their phones. You go to a website on your phone, and that has an accelerometer to detect the phone's position and translate that into a color. The goal is to match your color with the target color on the border. See right there. Then the color changes, and you have to make a new position to match it. If multiple people connect to the same game, everybody has to make the same color, so everybody has to make the same position. Here, you see that they're all making the same movements and dancing together. I started exhibiting Chromapose first at school, then at game events. The first thing I learned is that people will move. You just have to give them a clear goal, which requires them to move their body. I was surprised how much people were willing to get into weird positions like getting on the floor. Friends I knew showed different sides of themselves, more playful sides. And people will cooperate. Group dynamics are really powerful. If everybody's moving the same way, it's not weird for you to do it too. Cooperating gives people another goal. If one person has already reached the target position, other people can look at them to try to match them. I was surprised at the situations this created socially. People, even strangers, were willing to engage with each other. But no one was touching. So I made Interpose. I wanted to further explore touch and cooperation. Interpose is a game where you dance face-to-face with a partner. You put your phones back to back. The goal is still to match a target position together. Both players must move a ball into a hole on screen. But one person sees the vertical position and one person sees the horizontal position. So you have to cooperate. How did people respond to this? It was a little bit weirder. People are awkward. It's way more awkward than I imagined to hold two phones back to back and stare into each other's eyes, especially if you don't know each other. Physically, people have problems holding their phones like this, since it's not the way you usually hold the phone. Someone even dropped their phone and cracked it. I felt really bad. Later on, I iterated. I made little suction cups to connect the phones so people could hold their phones normally. That was a little easier. People also need to be silly. In the beginning, I had all these serious ideas that it would be an intimate experience, people would bond on a deep level, but I realized that people need to act silly and fun to do these things. The act of moving in weird ways does make you laugh, and when you're doing it with another person, you have to diffuse the tension. The laughter cuts through the awkwardness. It becomes a performance for other players and observers. But people will get close to each other. People told me that playing Interpose felt very intimate. I noticed that people who knew each other already had an easier time playing it, and they also went to greater lengths to move and touch. Again, I was surprised at how far people were willing to go, to contort their bodies and work together. But I was really frustrated at the phones. They felt like a big physical limitation that got in the way of people's movement. I had a lot more time and space for my final thesis project, so I decided to ditch the phones and go big. Light Touch Skin is a large-scale installation game. People control projections with their bodies. They have to fill a set of randomly generated shapes, so they end up contorting their bodies into weird positions. I used a Kinect to capture people's bodies and project it to their silhouettes back on the floor. That's me. If there's more than one person, the shapes scale up, so people must work together to fill them. The title Light Touch Skin refers to the projections against your skin. I made them neon colors with little pulsating dots to make you feel like your skin is crawling. I really wanted to create an immersive space, which kind of enabled players to act in new ways. When I finally exhibited this, I noticed that people use their whole body. Because they didn't have to use their phones anymore, this allowed an expanded range of movement, with a much lower barrier of entry. So they can use all four limbs, get on the floor, flop around, and have fun. I also noticed that some people avoided each other. Even when the game was cooperative and people had to get close to each other, people went out of their way to not touch each other. This goes back to society's touch phobia and the desire to give people personal space. I felt like there was a magnet almost like repelling people when they had to get close. I didn't build touch as a central component to this game like I did with Interpose. But some people did touch. I added a little bonus if two people got close together. It was kind of an accident actually. If two people got close enough together, then the Kinect would recognize them as one person and it would revert to a single player mode with one small shape. And this did create a more intimate experience. I liked it because it was optional. Now that you've seen a few examples of games that enable people to move and touch, let's look at a few theoretical concepts that explore why games can do this. Embodied play extends the body's physical capabilities into game space. I found out there are some guidelines to this. Games which use movement should build on movements that people already do, not make them do completely new ones. People's awareness of their own body is called the body schema. Games should extend this rather than break it. And this makes it easier for people to play the games and link them back to movements that they do in real life. For example, it's a lot easier to extend your arm out with your phone than to hold two phones back to back. It's even easier not to use a phone at all and just move your body. My games also use tools that we already know how to use, like phones. You could say our bodies are also tools. I'm using these tools, but also extending and subverting them, adding new capabilities like controlling projections. With emergent play, complex relations arise from simple rules. The goal can be to reach a target color or fill the generated triangles, but how players get there is up to them. Simple rules allow a lot of room for players' bodies to interpret them. Gameplay is enabled, but also limited by players' bodies and social norms. Much of the fun comes from pushing these boundaries and making people collaborate. Any multiplayer game also creates relationships between people. I try to create an emotional feedback loop between players by making them depend on and communicate with one another. Finally, I aim to create a magic circle. This is a concept from the game theorist Johann Huizinga, way back from the early 1900s. A magic circle is when a game suspends normal social rules and replaces them with its own. In my games, people did things they normally wouldn't, made new movements, touch each other. This is because of the framing. It's just a game. It's not real life. It's okay. And I noticed that the more immersive the game, the more intense the magic circle seemed to be. I saw people at their most playful and light touch skin. It was a full room of projections and people could use their whole body. The magic circle also goes back to how I use games to overcome my shyness and my touch aversion. I found that the person who needed the magic circle most was me, and I created it for myself. So I use these concepts as well as my experiences exhibiting my games to explore some broader conclusions and some new questions too. Movement is easy, touch is harder. Making people move is pretty easy, just tell them to. You have to create an interface which links body movements to gameplay and give players a clear goal. To create collaboration, you can make games where people must cooperate in order to win. But touch is harder. People were hesitant to do this. Interpose felt a lot more awkward than other games, and people had a harder time playing it. And with Light to the Skin, not a lot of people ended up touching because it wasn't required. I'm just gonna let this video play because it's funny. What does it mean to build touch into a game, given that people have different relationships to it, different levels of comfort? I really wanted to make people touch each other, but I realized you just can't force people to do that. You need to design for player consent and communication. Finding the right balance of encouraging touch is hard. I felt conflict between creating an intimate conceptual game, which extended as an idea even if people weren't willing to play it, versus a game which anybody could feel comfortable playing, but it might not be as interesting or thought-provoking. I really felt a tension between art, which is provocative, incites ideas, makes people uncomfortable, versus games, which people play and enjoy. In theory, I like the idea of making people uncomfortable, but in practice, it was difficult. I didn't have the heart to do it. I also thought, who is it serving to make people uncomfortable? It's easy to shock and discomfort people, but it's harder to design for consent and make sure everybody can play. People have to be willing to play your game. It's a collaborative experience between creators and players. And in an exhibition environment, the game has to advertise itself and draw people in. It has to have a low barrier of entry. For Light to the Skin, I went through several iterations actually, which did require players to touch. An early idea I had was to project onto a bed and two people could play, but like who's gonna play that? That really limits the audience. I ultimately made touch a bonus experience. Touch was possible if players wanted to, but it wasn't a core element of gameplay. How do playing my games make me feel? At the beginning, I talked about my own experience with touch phobia. After thinking about this and building my games for months, I was surprised that when I played with other people, even I felt the friction between intimacy and discomfort, especially with Interpose. I felt so awkward, and I didn't know whether to feel proud of myself that I had created a situation which made me feel awkward, or sad that I couldn't get over my own awkwardness. But I felt closer to people once we'd had that experience. One time I played Interpose with a stranger. We got really close, and afterwards we hugged. Ultimately, I felt like making and playing these games made me less shy. Touch is hard. Society establishes strong boundaries against touching other people. But through developing these games, I challenged my own boundaries and I created a space for other people to do that too. Games can expand the possibilities of movement and touch. To finish my talk, I'm going to ask you to consider a few questions. What is your own relationship to movement and touch? How have those feelings been influenced by culture? Have you ever tried to challenge those boundaries? Do you feel like you can challenge them by playing games like these? And finally, can you think of any other barriers that we might face? Whether those are technological barriers, physical barriers, social barriers. Do you think you can make a game that breaks these barriers? Thank you. Thank you to Game Devs of Color for the opportunity to speak. I'm Claire Kwong. I'm Eric Wina on Twitter and Instagram. You can find my work at clairekwong.com. And you can play Chromapose and Interpose by going to my site on your phone. Thank you so much.
So, what did you think of Claire's talk? Find anything interesting? If so, quick reminder that we do have Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Spread the love. Give us a shout out on these platforms. And remember, use our hashtag gdocExpo.